So for this demo of flexible metadata, this is kind of a provisional demo. I will be recording what will be more long-standing user-facing tutorial or documentation for how to use this to go along with written documentation that will be coming out soon. So do not lean on the explanations for the more technical aspects as gospel, because I'm still learning some of the ways that the flexible metadata setup in Haiku is differing from how some of the same functions worked in Allenson Flex and were documented there, and even differences in how the M3 schema that flexible metadata is adapting defines terms in a few cases. But this is a broad overview of what the process looks like and some of the changes that you can make to your metadata setup in Haiku using flexible metadata. So what flexible metadata in Hyku does is it enables administrators to configure which metadata fields appear for each work type and how those fields behave. So this includes setting field labels, requirements, whether fields can be repeated, whether they are searchable, and how they index. These configurations are defined in a YAML file that can be downloaded, edited in a text editor, and then re-imported through the Hyku admin interface. Flexible metadata manages these changes through a schema versioning system, so the changes can be made without affecting current works, while requiring edited works to be brought up to the most current schema. By externalizing metadata definitions from the application code, flexible metadata enables structured version control over metadata across collections and work types without developer intervention. But there are some limitations on that. For example, flexible metadata will enable you to add or remove metadata fields from work types, to map those fields to existing Dublin core terms, and to adjust how fields are indexed for searching. But flexible metadata can't create new Dublin core terms or introduce new Solr index categories on its own. So the best way to think about this is that the YAML file that you're editing through flexible metadata is a configuration layer. The changes that you make are effective only if the underlying Hyku application and search index are set up to support those changes. So in this short demo, I'm going to go through kind of the 5 basics of what flexible metadata can do. And that's how, first of all, how to access the metadata profiles module, how to download and edit the schema, how to import an updated schema, how the version management system works. That's all fairly high level and very quick to run over. And then I'll do a little bit of detailed look at the actual the YAML file itself and how you would make the kinds of changes that are going to be most common for users working in flexible metadata. So first of all, to access the metadata profiles module, once you have flexible metadata installed, which is to say that you're working on version 6.2 or later, it's worth noting that when you install 6.2, flexible metadata comes with 6.2. But in the installation, there is a flag that the developer can set so that you can have 6.2 or further versions of Haiku and not enable access to flexible or to metadata, to flexible metadata. And if you have that turned off, then this metadata profiles module just doesn't show. That's a configuration option when you first set it up, but that's all or nothing. So if you have it set up, then each new tenant in your system is going to have this when you create the tenant. If you don't have it set up, it won't show. And that does require developer customization at the point of installing or making changes to your system. But if you have flexible metadata enabled, which will be the default for 6.2 and further, you'll have this metadata profiles section. When you click on this section, it will take you, initially, you will only have this 1.0 initial profile that will be created at whatever time, I believe this
Right.
was created. Sorry, go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I didn't even know I was unmuted. I just wanted to
Oh,
say this is great. This is fantastic. Sorry.
good. I thought you were about to issue a correction.
0%. No, this is fantastic. Thank you.
Yep. So you'll have this initially, and then as you introduce new ones, you'll have this updated profile schema. So initially, you'll have this first one that says 1.0, and then you can access and edit the YAML file by downloading that file from that profile version. And then each new one you upload, the newly edited or changed YAML file will be associated with that profile version. So if you ever, for whatever reason, wanted to revert is not the right word. You can't revert to an earlier profile version, but if you wanted to, go back to version 3.0, you could download the 3.0 version, re-upload it, and then that would become a version 11 right here. And the state of that YAML file would exist for 11 and further. And the whole point of this versioning schema is doing that does not introduce, or any updates to your metadata profiles does not introduce any breaking changes to works that are already in the system. They will just be on whatever profile version they were uploaded under. But when you introduce the new schema version, then in order to go and edit that work, and I'll show you this here, um, you'll be able to see on the works page, it'll show you what version a work is running on. And if I wanted to come into this, which is running on version 3 currently, and I wanted to edit this work, then in order to edit it, it will have to come into compliance with the most recent version. Um, that applies to it. And I want to make that caveat. One thing I'm not going to show off in this demo is how contexts work, which enables you to have different profile versions running simultaneously set to different admin sets in your system. Um, and so that would actually add an additional layer of configuration if you want to. If you're just running one or two admin sets, or if you want changes to just apply across your tenant and not within specific admin sets, then the changes by default are applied at the tenant level. You have to do additional configuration in the YAML file if you want to isolate changes to a specific admin set. But then it behaves the same way just within whichever admin set a work is part of. Um, but so if I had changes to the metadata schema, for instance, if I added a new field as a required field, then I would not be able to save this here until I added metadata to the newly required field. But if the changes don't affect any, mandatory features of this, then I can just go in, edit, save, and it will automatically update this from the 3.0 version to the 10.0 version. And so if I had made changes to, for example, how fields are labeled on the public side, then those changes would be applied at the point I saved it, but not before I saved it. So it gives you, as a repository administrator, a lot of flexibility to make changes to your metadata schema, but they're not retroactively causing problems with works that were updated previously. But in order to be edited, they'll need to come into compliance with the new requirements. So that's a bit about the versioning system. And so in order to make changes, what you would do is have access to the most recent YAML file. And if you don't already have access to that, you can just download it here. So I'll download that and open this. And I realize now that you cannot see my notepad because I'm only sharing Firefox. So give me 1 second. Okay, so this is the file I just downloaded, the version 10, version 10 metadata profile from this tenant. And I will run over each of the major sections of this document. At first, it might look a little intimidating, but it breaks down into some fairly self-contained and intuitive sections. So first, you have this profile section. This does not update dynamically. No changes are made to this through subsequent downloading, uploading, making changes, whatever. So this is really a place for your internal record keeping if you want this to reflect versioning within the document itself. If you're not concerned about that because the application handles that essentially for you, then you can ignore it, but it will always be giving you this out-of-date information. The classes section is defining which work types and metadata profiles exist in your system. In the current version of flexible metadata, you can make some changes to these. For example, these are the out of the box for work types that will exist in Hyku that exist currently in 6.2. You can make some changes. For example, if you don't want generic works to have the big generic work label at the top, you could change this, right? You could change it to be blank. You could change it from generic work to just work. So you can change your display label there. At this point, flexible metadata does not enable the creation of brand new, my Control Z is not working, does not enable the creation of brand new work types just through this. That would have to be done with a developer. I think that there's some appetite for doing that in the future, but you can also see admin sets and collections exist here, and then a couple of hierarchs parallel resources. In general, with the exception of changing how some of these are labeled, not a whole lot to do in this classes section. Contexts is how you will define admin sets if you want to restrict changes only to specific admin sets. If you do not want to do that, if you just want to be able to update how metadata is displayed in your tenant, you never need to touch this. By default, when you install 6.2, you will have two contexts and there will be two admin sets automatically created in your system. So you'll have the default admin set and then one called special context. I think that's right. And you'll also see when you're editing, you might just have the default admin set, but have the ability to set it to either of these. Yes, Rob, you can probably detail that better than I did.
We leave the special context in as a defined context, but it doesn't automatically create an admin set or like hook it up to anything. It's mostly just here in the spec file to show you what the format of that is. So if you decide to use it, we don't create a second admin set by default.
Right. But if you go into edit an admin set, including that default one, or if you create additional admin sets, you will have a configuration option in the admin set to determine which one or multiple admin set settings or contexts are applied to that admin set. And that's all I'm going to say about context in this demo.
Just one more point of clarification there, Nick, if I may.
Mhm.
If you have a property, which I know you're going to talk about properties in a minute, that does not have any context set, it applies to all contexts.
Yes.
So just to be clear that the default context isn't like a special context that things just get automatically. It's that if you're specifying any of them and you want that property to remain in the default context also, you have to just define default there. So like the minute you add the context block to a property, then you have to specify all of the context you want that property to appear in. But if you don't specify any context at all, then it applies to all contexts.
Yes, exactly. And that's the default, right? So unless you specifically add a context to a property, which I'll show in a sec, so unless you go out of your way to do that, then the changes you make to properties will apply across your entire tenant. So the default behavior is everything applies universally in your tenant, unless you take additional steps to restrict it only to a specific context. And that's all I'm going to say about contexts. The next section is mappings. It's used for internal system mappings, and you should not be messing with any of this stuff. Do not modify this section. And then the next section is properties, starting here. Yeah, that's right. Starting here. And this is the main section that you'll be editing when you want to make changes in flexible metadata. Each metadata field is defined in its own block. And the main things you can do are change the field's display name with the display label value, mark it as required or as repeatable, specify which work types use the field, modify the indexing or mappings, but again, that's only for indexing options and mapping options that are already set up in your system. So there's a couple of those, or a few of those. You can determine which of them that is used for this field. And you can add example values, which are only documentation. They don't show up in the form for the end user, but they exist as documentation within your schema, which if you're adding a lot of properties, doing some really bespoke complex metadata, and you want to have this schema also function as documentation for the metadata librarian who will be doing this work, then you might want to use example values in this form and then share that with the metadata librarian who's going to be working in it for improved consistency for use. But that is not going to like appear as help text in the form, for example. And you can add multilingual labels. Some fields already have this set up. Again, that would only function for the languages that are built into the system on the coding side, but that's accessible through here. So let's look at an example of doing this and what some of the detailed language around that looks like. So I don't know if you can see my search bar, but I'm searching down for the description field. So this is within the properties section, and then this is the block that defines description down until the sample value is the last value for this. Different properties will have different values under them. In some cases, these will not be identical from one to the other. So if it follows a system default, then it might not have an individual listing for a value because it matches the default. So they're all going to have available on, they're all going to have cardinality, they're all going to have multi-value. Some might not have a sample value listed. So it's not 1000% consistent from what the last value under a property is going to be. But the next, and this is where indentation is actually very significant to interpreting this YAML file. And so that is something that a user can kind of mess up when they're playing in here. So you can tell here that this is the entirety of the description property, that one property in the properties section, and then an identifier begins here. There are better text editors than Notepad that will do some additional contextualizing if you want to work on that, but it is possible to do all of these edits within Notepad. But so a couple of changes that we might want to make. Available on by default, description exists for collection and for our 4 out-of-the-box work types. If for whatever reason you don't want ETD to be able to use the description field, say you want to force them to use abstract only, then you can remove it from that by removing this line. And now description will no longer appear in the ETD work type. Multi-value, that's the ability you could have multiple description boxes, and each of them will populate as sub boxes, but under the same label on the form. If you don't want to enable that and you want to force them to work within the single text box, then you can change this from true to false. Display label, the place to change this is right here. So if you want a description to always appear as a author's description, that's a very specific restriction of what description means. But if that's what was applicable in your use case, you would add that here, and you can retain the default, but that would override the default. And now on the public form, when people are seeing this, the description field will be named author's description. I believe that change is also reflected on the, now I need to double check this, but on the form where on the user upload form where you're doing the entry. Could be wrong on that. I need to double check that. Form, there are several things that can go under form, and they will be applied if relevant. So some of your fields, for example, this is where you would put required. And because this is not required, it's not added there. Now we can make this a required field. Primary is determines whether it appears above the fold or below the fold, or if you push the additional fields button, does it populate there, or does it show up above that button and populates automatically? So now I've changed it so the description is a required field and is also in that top section of metadata fields. You don't have to push the additional fields button in order to get down to where description is. It'll remove it from the alphabetical order that those would have, and so on. So those are kind of the primary changes. There's a few others. Indexing, you have the option of which fields are displayable, which fields are searchable as well as displayable. So searchable fields will show as faceted links that will then take you to a search within the system to search for that term, which like keyword behaves that way by default, right? Description doesn't. You don't click on a description and go to a search for the exact string of the description field. And so that's, you can configure that under indexing. External link fields will render as a clickable hyperlink. So like the rights statement, the copyright URL, that's configured as an external link. If for whatever reason you didn't want it to, you could change that only to searchable, and then it'll search internally for things that match that, but not take you out to that URL. And then mappings govern which Dublin core fields a metadata field maps to. So this could be used to adjust output fields, how it would interact with like OAI, for example, or if you have a configuration that pulls out your information to an external system. I feel like that would mostly use OAI, but it can't add new output fields. It's only the DC term fields that are already defined in the system config files. But so you would make your changes here, save this file, and then I'm going to stop sharing again and pull us back to the repository. And then at this point, I would import, select the document I just edited, import. It will create did something I didn't like. But if you do it, so in the course of this demo, I did something that is not permissible. But when you upload it, it'll create a new profile version here, and then that will impact future works will be uploaded on the most recent profile version. There's no option to choose an earlier one. And one of the changes that comes with that is when you go to add a new work, you have to select the admin set before you begin the process, because that's going to set definitions for the form that you will see when you go to create a work. Although it does enable you to make changes here, but those changes won't be dynamically shown on the form there. So I'm not sure if that can actually run you into trouble or not. Probably would enable you to do things that the system would just not reflect. But yeah, so that's the basic system. I guess I'll stop sharing now and open for questions. But I'm going to have a video tutorial showing the default metadata profile, and then actually making, uploading a work, making changes to how some of the fields behave through the YAML file, uploading it, adding a new work that shows the new changes, and then editing the previous work to the first work. So I'll have examples of that. And then I'll have written documentation for all of these changes. But that, yeah, like I said, there are some things in the YAML file that are technically editable by you as a user, but that the system, either it will not create changes, so you might think that it's going to, but it's not. So entering sample values, for example, or there's some things that you could try to change, the field mapping of something, but if you're entering terms that are not mapped in the system, then it's not going to function correctly. Or there are some that are outside of the internal logic that the M3 schema uses, and so it'll actually reject your attempt to upload it, which we just saw there with one of the example changes that I made in that. But that's the process at this point for making changes in your YAML file, and then introducing it to your system, and then continuing to work in the system with that.
Wow. Does anybody have any questions for Nick? That was a really great overview. And I know it took you weeks to figure out, if not a month or two, to figure all that out. Thank you for all that time. Questions from anybody? Feel free to speak up.
I have a question, and maybe it's got a difficult answer. But so my curiosity is about shared search, and when two tenants have made edits to a similar field, such as changing the display name or other aspects of it, how does that affect downstream to shared search? Or have we figured that out just yet?
So it shouldn't, and I'd like to hear, that's a great question, Anne Marie. I will answer that in a second. Maybe Rob can speak to this as well, but my understanding is that the fact that this just functions as essentially a configuration layer on top of the solar indexing and the mapping that is already built into the system. You can't actually introduce breaking changes to search. You may end up with fields that in the shared search environment don't, like, your bespoke display label will not override what is the system default, or with I shouldn't say the system default, I should say the settings in the search tenant. Right? Those settings that's how labels will display. So you'll have an example of a work that you have your bespoke display labels in your tenant. When it shows up in the shared search environment, those fields will be mapped according to the settings of the search tenant. And then when you click through, they will have different display labels. But the underlying solar indexing and DC mapping will be what's defined in the system.
It's actually a little more subtle than that, Nick. You're really very close to nailing that. and it is complicated? It's a great question, Amanda. I think that it is certainly a part of the system we put a lot of thought into. In the upstream M3 profile definitions, they use or recommend, it's not really, I don't think, a codified part of the spec, different names for the indexing fields. So we call them based on what Solar actually uses them as. And there's like a like surface level mapping that used to be used really popularly in Hyrax, has been removed from Hyrax for some time now. Like facetable, displayable, those labels are in the M3 spec. Again, I think mostly just as examples. I don't think they're actually codified in the spec, where we would use a title underscore TESM to specify that it's a text English field, and title underscore SSIM to say that we want to index that as a individual string. And those indexed fields are what your sidebar facets are going to be based on, right? So in universal search, if you're, or in, sorry, not universal search, in a shared search environment, if we have, let's say, I don't know, a field like width, right? And we specify the width of a picture of an image. And it's, we specify that as width underscore, and I'm not even going to guess off the top of my head what the integer one is, but there's one that's just numbers. Then those would be universally comparable to any other field. You could call the field something else, right? But you would, as long as it's indexed on the same field, it would appear in the same facet, right? So if we're using, I don't know, maybe subject is a facet that we have, and we've specified what subjects are, or type, like image, moving image, etc. Then as long as you can call the field anything you want, you can name, like you can label the field anything you want, you can have it be whatever field you want stored in the metadata underneath. But if you index it as type underscore SSIM, then it's going to show up as that type facet in a shared search environment. So they kind of have to be matchy at the index level for that piece. Everything Nick said about how the labels are rendered is 100% correct.
And is that Solar indexing piece configurable at the end user level or not? Like, can they
In
mess
the,
with that stuff?
yeah, in flexible metadata, you're specifically specifying what indexed, what you want indexed, right? So you can say, okay, for type, I want to specify it as a string, and I want to specify it as a text. So it can show up if I do free text for image, but it'll also, have be that sidebar facet. And so by kind of breaking with the M3 schema just a little tiny bit, or using some of the flexibility built into it, we've given you, I think, quite a bit of power here to get your sidebar facets and your display labels and which things show up in the, when you're doing a search, you see the blurb of the item, the abbreviated view. Like those things are all essentially configurable from the M3 profile because of the way we did the indexing setup.
And so, for example, if you wanted to add a property, and you wanted to call, a property for, say, annotator's notes, right? Then you would determine how that would index, and you could index it as description, for example, and then the description field will show annotator's notes and description. Right? Do I have that right, Rob?
All right. So a couple places for further enhancement down the road that I think would be interesting would be, one, the ability to make fields to have permissions. So it's not uncommon to have annotator notes is a great example, Nick, of something you want only to show up when you're editing work and never to actually be displayed. And then sometimes you want things to be repository administrator only fields on a work, and not even displayed to users who can edit that work. That's a place for enhancement. I would love to get those examples that are in the YAML file showing up in the form at some point. That'd be a nice place where we can enhance things. Like there's still lots of little room for like further changes and enhancement here. But I do think we're covering the vast majority of the like day-to-day bases, and I'd love to get people using this to find out if that's really.
Okay.
Hey,
well,
Nick, you had identified another question about bulk racks. Its
Yeah,
implications
so I
on
want to
that.
answer. I think that came from Anna Marie.
Yes.
So changes that you make to your metadata schema through flexible metadata are not automatically made to the bulk racks mappings. That is part of the reason why we brought bulk racks mappings into the individual account settings. And so there's a demo for that from our last Hyku Interest Group meeting for anyone who wasn't there. So you can actually modify your bulk racks field mappings directly in your account settings. And so the workflow, if you make changes to field mapping specifically. So if you add a property that isn't already in your in a work type, then in order for bulk racks to be able to parse that column and add it to that model, which is how bulk racks identifies work types, you have to make that change in your bulk racks mappings in your own account settings. So if you're adding additional additional metadata fields, those columns will either they'll go ignored essentially until you add them as fields in your bulk racks settings. So the workflow would be make your updates through flexible metadata, then go to your bulk racks mappings, and then add those fields in there. If the changes that you made are just configuring, for instance, a display label, but doesn't actually add a new property or change the mapping, then anything you import through bulk racks is going to reflect those changes the same way that adding it through the regular uploader would.
Anna Marie, do you have any other follow-up questions for him?
I think Sheena has a clarification on that.
Okay, that's great.
Oh, yeah. So the bulk racks will use the latest schema that you uploaded. The part I wanted to correct, I guess, is if you add a new property and that's not in your bulk racks field mappings, bulk racks by default will still honor it if it's in the CSV. But if you wanted to, I don't know, split on a certain character, for instance, that needs to be applied to the new property. That's what needs to be in that bulk racks field mappings setting.
Oh, interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Or did I explain that?
It is matched perfectly.
Say that again, Rob. You broke up a little bit.
So if you add a field called display and you have a field that's in your CSV that's called, you're gonna get the same match.
Yeah, so the mappings it would have to match precisely. Whereas
Okay.
if you wanted to, you could go into your bulk racks mappings in your account settings and add additional variants on which it would trigger and honor that, including like is the term capitalized or not? Like that has to be an exact match unless you add additional flexibility, additional customization to the mappings. I think that's the point Rob is making there.
Yes.
We do
so,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Shanna. No,
I
go
was
ahead.
going to say, to put a point on that, if you have a new property in your metadata profile, let's say it's called foo, your column in your CSV needs to be called foo. But if for whatever reason you want to upload it with a different column name, for instance, or have some kind of other special configuration, that then you need to put foo in your bulk racks field mappings to set up the whatever customizations that you want.
I just wanted to say that Randy has one more question in chat. Just to clarify, when we add a new metadata schema in Hyku, can we manage that schema through the profile YAML file?
And so is the question, if we added a metadata schema not through flexible metadata, right? That if that were go ahead, Randy.
Yeah, like mods or something like that. Actually through the code.
I do not know how that would interact with, and especially if you're doing it post-install, right? Because my understanding is that the version 1.0 YAML file that you have is based off of the system config file. So if there were, if you, while you're doing your installation of Hyku, if you had additional metadata that are not the default out of the box, that the initial YAML file from the Hyku version or the profile 1.0 should be an exact match for that, and should be manageable through flexible metadata, just like any of the out of the box ones. What I'm not sure about is if you have a Hyku system up and running and then go in and add additional work types on the back end. If the flexible metadata, if the YAML file dynamically adjusts to account for that, but I think Shayna might have an answer.
It does not currently. Okay. It's not, yeah, it's not a reflection of your system yet.
So then,
but that is on our to-do list.
Gotcha. So if you added additional work types, you would still be able to use flexible metadata to make changes to the work types that are managed through that. But that you would have to, there'd be additional work to make the new work types responsive to the flexible metadata options.
Cool, thanks.
And that definitely does sound like an area for future enhancement of flexible metadata.
While we have everybody here, I mean, those of us who are Hyku, we know that, this is coming in 6.2, but there's also been work on the Hyrax side. And if there's anybody we have some Hyrax users in here, if anybody can give us an idea of the status of flexible metadata in Hyrax, that would be helpful. Can anybody speak to that?
The last two things actually really tie together, Christine. One of the requests on the Hyrax side before integrating this fully into Hyrax main is that it be model by model instead of being all or nothing, which it currently is in Hyku. And we're doing refactoring to get it to be model by model. That is in progress. I have the first PR has a weird bug I haven't been able to figure out for like a week, but once I figure that out, it'll be ready to go. And then the actual model by model piece will get layered in, and then kind of all the UI changes come in the last step. So I'm anticipating that coming in this summer, which I feel like I should say in my like movie announcer voice, but so that's definitely in progress. There just was a hiccup of the sort of a design, fundamental like architecture and design issue that needed to be rethought. And in addition to that, there's some Hyrax kind of magical code that needs to be removed to make way for flexible metadata. So there'll be some things that are actually, I think, trip up a lot of developers that get smoothed out here as part of that code base. That's in progress. It will mean if you upgrade, so right now, if you upgrade a model or you upgrade an existing Hyku from like 6 or 6.1 or 5 something to 6.2, you're gonna need to take any custom model definitions you have and map those into your M3 profile on day one. Otherwise, you'll only be able to edit the title of those works until you do so. And so that's like kind of the piece at the moment. And in the next step, once the Hyrax stuff gets merged all the way back in, there'll be a moment where you need to drop a like one-liner into each model file to like connect everything. So those instructions will be made very clear in the release notes as best we can to try and be as supportive as we can on those. And I will tell you the mapping process, like going to your existing model properties and putting them in the MP3 profile. The first one is hard, and then the rest are really easy. Like you just get the hang of it pretty quickly. It's not that complex a format, but just sort of the mental mapping between the two would be a great thing to bring to the Not Yet office hour, because they're pretty darn good at it at this point. They've done a bunch of them already.
The once Hyrax is updated to include the model, is that going to be brought back into Haiku as well, the model piece?
Yes.
Okay.
So we've been trying to raise funds to do a major Rails version upgrade. In parallel to that, the Hyrax folks have backported Hyrax to the older version of Rails that Haiku currently uses. So we're gonna really do work to get everything back on main for Hyrax in order to further both Haiku and Hyrax development kind of more in sync. I don't want them splitting off from each other in any way. So my expectation, my hope, my big dream is to be doing the IQ upgrade to Hyrox main in, I would say, August, and then be working on the Rails upgrade like right on top of that. Because I would love to come to Connect in October with a version of Haiku that's running on a stable version, supported version of Rails, the latest of Hyrax. And then there's a bunch of little things that we want to do, like little features and enhancements that have all been sort of waiting for this big set of transitions around Valkyrie and flexible metadata to be done, that I'd love to start work on with the energy that we generate from Connect. Usually there's a big burst of energy right after Connect, and that's kind of, in my mind, what would be the right things to work on that at that point.
Okay. One more question, just for clarification's sake, and I don't know, Nick, if this is Nick Don, if this is yours or it's Rob's, but there are two phrases that are thrown around, Allenson Flex and flexible metadata, and you've been very, very specific about flexible metadata, but yet this has been for years been called Allenson Flex, but there is a difference, and I was wondering if somebody could speak to that just to clarify that for the group.
Sure, I'll do my best. So essentially, flexible metadata is the application of the Allenson Flex gem to the Valkyrized environment. It does function somewhat differently, and the largest practical difference for an end user is that Allenson Flex included a graphic UI that the end users would use, so they were not having to work directly within the YAML file. The underlying architecture still used modifications to a YAML file, but they didn't have to download, make the changes, and upload it. They had a graphic user interface where they could make some of those specific changes. So that's the cosmetic difference, is you're not working within the GUI, but that there is architectural difference in terms of flexible metadata relates to the underlying database differently. And so the backporting of flexible metadata into Hyrax will include that architectural change.
Yeah, flexible metadata is a concept, and Allenson Flex was an implementation of that concept for active Fedora-based models. And instead of implementing it separately as a separate gem for Valkyrie, we're integrating it into Hyrax from the bottom up.
Thank you so much.
Go
ahead, sorry.
I was going to say that raises a question that I'd be interested in feedback on, including from anybody who watches this demo in future and has opinions. I'd love people to contact me with this, because I really want to know the community's appetite for how vital is it to have in the future a graphic user interface to make these changes versus the current workflow, which is to work directly within the YAML file. I feel like there are pros and cons to each of those. But that's something I'm really interested in getting broad. And I think that eventually we'll want more formal data collection data collection approaches to taking the temperature on that, because that's maybe a decisive decision, a significant decision that we can take in the future as far as how we want to develop flexible metadata.
Nick, Don, would you, for those people who are listening to the recording, provide an email address how to contact you?
Sure, Nick at Palney, NIC at palney.edu. Or yeah, that's the most universal way, or hit me up on Slack.
Okay. I see Shanna has another.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Somebody was going to say something.
Sorry, I was also just to bring the feedback a little bit more public. It would be great to post it into the Hyku channel regarding flexible metadata. Yeah. I'm sure Nick will surface it either way, but yeah.
Shanna has some questions in Slack in the chat as well. Will flexible metadata work? Whoops. Yeah. Will flexible metadata work if someone is using Hyku without Valkyrie? It's the first question.
Rob just replied right after. I'll just read it. He says, we aren't supporting new features on active Fedora models at this time. However, it would be pretty simple, say 1 or 2 days to make them cross-compatible.
There you go. Thank you, Shanna. Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, and
then
just to put a finer point on that, you should not just include the Allenson Flex gem in a Hyku 6.2 app. Those two things are going to have conflicts in model naming and some of the ways things are called. With that could be ironed out, but I think fundamentally, since we're pushing folks to move away from active Fedora, period, and current Hyku doesn't have any active Fedora direct access models in it anymore. That that would be a pretty special case at this point.
Okay. Any other questions for anybody in the room? Going once, going twice. If everybody, this has been a huge lift. If everybody would just thank the developers and Nick Don for putting in the time to make it happen and to bring it to us, I think that would be really great. I mean, it's just been a lot of work to bring this to us. It's been in the community as a thought for years, and to finally bring it this far is great. So thank you everybody who had a piece, and those developers who aren't here, if you guys could let them know how much we appreciate it, that would be wonderful.